big year in baseball this year. Big year for a lot of things, right? But a big year in baseball. Some of you are baseball fans, others of us are, we kind of watch from a distance every now and again. But if you haven't heard, the Chicago Cubs, well, they won the World Series after 108 years. You can imagine there was a bit of a party in Chicago. An estimated 5 million people turned up for the party, actually, at one time. I just want to show you a clip as we begin of Ben Zobrist, and he was the MVP for the series, and I think his speech has a lot that we can learn from it. So let's just take a quick look at this as we begin this morning.
And this next gentleman wants to say a few words. World Series MVP Ben Zobrist. Wow, it's unbelievable. I can't believe this. You know what, I'm holding this thing. This game makes a lot of individual awards, but this is definitely a team award for this team. This is a team full of MVPs, and we're in a city of MVPs. Look, I've been blessed far more than I ever deserved or expected in this game. God has given a lot to me, and I'm so thankful for that. He gave me the opportunity to hold a trophy just like that last year and hoist it up. And I thought, how can I ever top this? And then I started thinking about Chicago. I started thinking about Wrigley Field, 108 years. And I said, I want to be part of that. So I promise you, I prayed during free agency last year to be a Chicago Cub. Thankfully, God and the Cubs, thank you, Theo, made it happen. And I embarked on a journey with these guys to bring this elusive championship to the north side. Life expectations this year, these guys met every one of them. We all year long battled together, and we had it. We knew we had it until we were down 3-1 in the World Series. It was silent in that clubhouse, let me tell you. And then the man, the myth, the legend, David Ross spoke up. He said, "No, don't do that. Don't hang your heads." He said, "We're the best team." He said, "We've come back. We've won 3 games in a row, a lot this year, and we're going to do it." He said, one pitch, one inning at a time. And then, the next day, the Italian stallion, our own Italian stallion, Anthony Rizzo, Rocky movies all day long in the clubhouse. Rocky quotes. And now I'm a small town Illinois kid, grew up downstate, but I used to watch Rocky movies to be inspired before my games when I was a kid. So you better believe when he started that stuff up, I was all about it. And I was pumped up. And sure enough, I tell you what, this team answered the bell. Games 5, 6, and 7, it was like a heavyweight fight. And this ball club pulled through for all of you. Thank you so much, Chicago, for this opportunity. Thank you so much. This is your team. Thank you.
All right, wow.
We honor their sacrifice and their service.
There's a lot to love about that speech. Notice how Ben, he's given MVP, Most Valuable Player award. What does he do? He points back. He points away from himself. This game, he says, makes a lot of individual awards. This is definitely a team award for this team. This team's full of MVPs, a city full of MVPs. Today we're finishing our series called Soma, which is a Greek word that means body. And in the letter that we're reading, a guy by the name of Apostle Paul, he uses the word body as a metaphor for the church, the people of God. He says we're like a body, a single unit that has many parts: eyes, ears, nose. All the different parts form and make up the one body of Christ. Single unity, a team, you might say, where every single person matters, where all are gifted by God. All are called to serve, not themselves, but the others and the rest of the world around us, to care for the common good of our world. And notice the way that Ben pointed past himself there. He holds up the MVP trophy, but he doesn't draw it back to himself. He points to the team. Ben is really, out of his relationship with Jesus, actually, reflecting what the Apostle Paul has been saying in the past few chapters of this section of this letter. That we are a team. That we work together as a team. That we're always better together, period. And then there was this part. He said this, I just quote him. We all year long battled together. We had it. We knew we had it. Until, we have those until moments sometimes, don't we? Until we were down 3-1. It was silent in the clubhouse, I tell you. But then the man, the myth, the legend, David Ross, he spoke up and said, no, don't do that. Don't hang your heads. And he said, we've won 3 games in a row lost this year. We're going to do it one pitch, one inning at a time. What a great example of encouragement, eh? That he can say to the other guys when their heads are down, don't do that. Don't do that. Know that we can accomplish this. But you know, as a church, I think he's setting us a great example too. That we can say to each other when we're down in many different areas in our lives, don't do that. Don't hang your heads. Remember whose you are. That you belong to the God of the universe. You've been bought with a price. You're his. And he has a good future in store for you. And he has his grace that empowers you. Don't hang your head. Now, some of you are particularly good at encouraging others. You're sort of a David Ross in our midst. Gifted encouragers. But you know, I think that this is a role that every person, whether it's on your ball team or whether it's us as a church community, we can all be those people who say, don't hang your head, lift them up. We can all be those who encourage those around us. Can we do that? Yeah, we can. But then there's my favorite part of this speech. Ben said when these guys are down, and everyone's kind of down in the mouth, their heads are low. He says the next day, the Italian stallion, a Rocky reference, of course, our own Italian stallion, Anthony Rizzo, played Rocky movies all day long in the clubhouse. Rocky quotes. And then Ben says, you know, I used to watch Rocky movies myself as a kid. They'd inspire me before my games. And so you got to believe when he brought this stuff up, I was all about it. I was pumped. And sure enough, I tell you what, this team answered the bell. Games 5, 6, 7, like a heavyweight fight. This ball club pulled through for all of you. Okay, true confession here. Late 80s, early 90s, my best friend at the time, Greg Inskip, I'd go over to his house and we'd watch Rocky movies. And then we'd get socks, wool socks, put them on our hands, and just for the next hours, just beat each other. That's what we did. That's what we did for fun. You want to get inside the head of 11-year-old boys? That's how to do it. That's what's going on. But I just consider what happened in the clubhouse that day. When they put on those Rocky movies, what happened? What was going on? The Rocky movie, actually all of them, are essentially the same story. It's about an underdog. The one who's got the odds stacked against him coming back to win. Every movie has this theme. The Cubs, at this low point, they were playing Rocky films. Why? To get into that story. To make that story their story. They were the Rocky. And this story gave them hope. It gave them a sense of if Rocky can do it, we can do it. It gave them the ability to believe in a particular kind of future where they could be victorious, where they could break the 108-year drought. The truth is, we as humans are hope creatures. We need a story that makes sense of, that connects the dots, so that we don't just have all these meaningless events. A story is what connects the events. But you know, the other thing about a story is stories go somewhere. They have a climax. And we too, when we look at our own story, we have to be able to look ahead and say, what's coming down the line? What am I living for? What am I living toward? Maybe our question this morning is, Rocky's a movie, baseball's a game. But all of us as human beings, we need a hope of a larger kind of scale than just what the Rocky movies gave the Cubs for those few games. We need a hope that a big enough story to find out if it can answer the questions that our lives most desperately need to answer. So this isn't a naive optimism that we need. We need something real. We need a concrete story, a historical story. And that's what our text gives us today. Real hope. We're looking at this letter that Paul writes to a really new church that's been planted in Corinth. Now, Corinth is a port city in Greece. It's still there, of course, but this is obviously in the first century he's writing. And Paul has planted, he's shared the good news of this church. They've believed it. They've staked their ground on what he preaches. But some problems start arising as soon as Paul leaves. He's gone. He's in a different city now. And let me give you a quick summary to catch us up. One of the problems is disunity. Ever played on a team that wasn't unified? That's what's going on in this church. See, some were living with a sense of competition, not healthy competition in a sports team kind of sense, but where one person is feeling like, man, I got to show how I'm superior to the others around me, how I'm the best. And so what happens when your team is disunified is you stop playing against the opponent, you start playing against each other, right? That you would be the one who gets the glory, that you're the one who gets who's seen as the one who's glorified, lifted up. But see what Ben did? He said, no, the MVP's not for me, it's for the whole team. Point away from himself. He's got that sort of humility. The Corinthian church, they didn't understand that. They're living out as self-absorbed, prideful, rather than recognizing the contribution of every person. They didn't understand that each of them needed all the others. That's true for your team, isn't it? Each of you needs all the other people to do their part. And everybody has to be recognizing the others. That's true for us as a church. All of us need to be recognizing that we need everyone else, all their gifts, all that God has equipped them with to serve us and the rest of the world together. But there's also some other stuff going on. Not only did they have a misunderstand the body in terms of the church as a unit, they're misunderstanding their human, physical, individual bodies too. See, the Greco-Roman worldview would say the spirit and soul, that's good. The material world, it's actually kind of gross, kind of dirty, doesn't really matter what you do with it. So what some people had done in that community is they kind of slumped back away from a Christian view of the world, which says matter matters. Our bodies matter. Our spirit, our soul, and our body are all meshed in together. So you can't say, well, that's my spiritual life, and this is just my other life. You can't do that in Christianity. But this church was doing that. And what it had led some of them to do is even, some of the guys were going to the temple prostitutes and the pagan temples and having sex with prostitutes and thinking that's no big deal. And Paul is writing this letter and saying, actually, that's a huge deal. It's a big problem. And so what he's doing in this letter throughout is Paul is correcting their values. What they're saying is important. He's correcting their practices, what they do on a regular basis. But the way he does it isn't just to say, well, don't do that. That's not the issue. He gets underneath and deals with their vision of the world, of God, of themselves. And he offers them a new frame, a lens through which they're to look at the world and to look at themselves and their church. And that's what this text is about. It's giving them a new lens, a story that they're to live by. Like the Rocky movies, that shaped and gave the Cubs a sense of, we're going to live into that story for this set of games. That's going to become our story. What Paul is giving the church is a much bigger story than that. And it's not just a made-up story. It's the true story of how God, through his son Jesus, conquers death and gives us a hope and gives us a new frame by which we look at and live into the world as well. Listen to how Paul begins. He says it this way in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 4. We're going to read. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel. Gospel means good news. I remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you believed in vain. So what did they receive? Well, he tells us next. Here is what they received. The content of the gospel, you might say, is this. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures. You know, if I were to ask you, any one of you folks from Summit Drive here, what is the good news of Jesus? What things would you have to say, according to this passage? Does this summarize for us the hope of the gospel? I think it does. We need to say this, first of all, that Christ died. But notice he tells us why. For our sins. His death was not a terrible accident. It was a purposeful event. It was for us. Jesus had planned to give his life as a ransom, a way to buy back broken, fallen humanity for himself. To pay for all the things I had done wrong and you had done wrong. And he exchanges his perfect, sinless record for mine, which is anything but that, when I trust him. It's the most incredible act of love. And love, you see, is always for the sake of others. He did it for us. But notice, too, what Paul says next. This death was according to the Scriptures. Certainly, he has in mind where there's particular texts that point forward to the Messiah who would be crucified, who would die, Isaiah 53 being one of those. But I think he's pointing back to the whole arc of the storyline of the Bible, too. See, the Bible tells us a story of God's creating us for himself, for relationship. But it also tells us of how that comes unraveled. That through human rebellion against God, through our own self-centeredness, like we've messed this place up. And we all know that. I don't need to spend any time arguing that. Our pride, when we put ourselves first, when we try to live on our own terms rather than what God has called us to, boy, that harmony that we're meant to live in comes unraveled. But this story that the Bible tells us, it comes to a climax. And that climax is what Paul's talking about here, the death and then resurrection of Jesus. You know, the Rocky movies, they always come to a climax too. It's when Rocky is up against the ropes. Every movie, check it out, every movie. He's up against the ropes. This is, I think it's Igor, I can't remember, this is Rocky 4. But the Russian guy is pounding the life out of him. It looks like all hope is lost. He's taking shot after shot, and somehow the Italian stallion rallies. And he delivers the blows to the opponent that bring him to the ground. There's victory. But you ask the question in Rocky's case, for what? What's the victory for? He tells you in Rocky 1. Why do you fight, Rocky? Why do you work so hard? He says this, to prove that I'm not a bum. He's justifying himself. He's saying, I got to prove myself. That's why I work so hard. You see what Jesus is doing? He's not proving himself. He's working for the sake of others. He's working to release us, to free us from our major opponent, the one we could never defeat. Later on in the text, Paul says this, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Yes, death is an enemy. And there is no hope that you or I can defeat death. What Paul is declaring here, what the early Christians bet their lives on, was that Jesus really is our victor, that he is our champion, that he fights for us the battle we can never win on our own. And that is the battle against evil itself, and the death that ensues, and the broken relationship with God that's the fallout of it all. But Jesus comes in and he fights the battle for us. You know, Paul says that he was laid in a tomb. I think that's important. He is really and truly dead. The maker is unmade in death. Why? So that you and I can be remade in him. And the reason that we know it's true, if a guy says, I'm going to die for your sins, great, guy dies. How do you know? You know, is it real? you're going to have hope for eternal life if I die. Okay, the guy dies and he's laying dead in a tomb. How would you ever know it was true? The text tells us that he did not stay dead. He defeated death by delivering death the death blow, that for all of eternity, death might die permanently. So that you and I can have the hope that Paul talks about here. Listen to how confident Paul says it. He quotes from Isaiah, who's a prophet 500 some odd years before Jesus, and says this: death has been swallowed up in victory. I love that image. It's like death is this thing. Life is so much bigger, it can just swallow it all up. It can take it up into itself, exhaust the power of evil, and Jesus rises victorious over it. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Swallow it up. All the pain and suffering you and I will face in our lives, it will get swallowed up one day. And that will just make the joy so much sweeter of being in God's presence. That's what Paul says the hope of the gospel gives us. It swallows death. Just gulps it down. He quotes the prophet Hosea, who says this: where, O death, is your sting, your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The victory of death has itself been defeated, he says. The sting of death, that sense of finality, that when you're dead, you're just dead, that is gone. Yes, Paul says we will die too. We will physically, yep, we're going to die. All of us will have that same thing. But it doesn't have to hurt in the same way. We don't have to fear death in the same way because it's not our end, nor is it the end of those loved ones of ours who have trusted Jesus too. Our hope is to be reunited with them. My dad was dying of cancer in 2009. He didn't want to die. You know, it wasn't like, oh, I just got to give myself over this. No. God has given us life because that's what God is about, is life. And so everything in us kicks against death. He didn't want to die. Even still, though, when he faced his inevitable death, he dealt with it in the hope that it wasn't the end. So the sting was gone. Evil doesn't win. Our sin doesn't determine our outcome. Jesus' victory determines our outcome. And that gave us hope too. That while we grieved knowing that our story with my dad is not over. That fills me with hope. And I want to say too, death really is an enemy. It's become popular in recent literature and philosophy to say something like the British editor Diana Athill. She argues that it's silly to be frightened of being dead. It's an article that she wrote a few years back. Here she says that death is just a natural part of life. And if it's natural, it shouldn't be feared. We should just embrace it. And in fact, this view gets popularized in movies like The Lion King. And some of you have seen that. It's kind of helping children make sense of death by saying, well, when you die, you know, it's the song, right? Circle of life. Kind of goes on like this. The point is to say, well, your body will go back into the ground, and then it will become, worm food and give back to the earth. And so things will grow up as a result of that. That's how you live on. You live on through the ecology of the soil. I can understand what's attractive about that reasoning. I can. The first part of the argument is biologically true. I mean, my undergrad's in biology, and that's what happens to bodies when they die. They become part of the earth. They become fertilizer. So it's biologically true. And that part I can agree with and say, yeah, that's true. But there's some big problems with this view as well. One of them is just this, that, and I think it's a good argument, though it might sound silly at first. Death doesn't feel natural, as Dylan Thomas writes. However biologically necessary it may be, this feeling cannot be put to death by reasonable consideration about the cycle of nature. We simply do not feel like recycled fertilizer. So we can't just reason away our fear of death by saying it's natural. The human experience tells us, even if we understand death biologically, somehow death does seem like an enemy that we fight against. But the second problem, this is a much more important one, is this. How do you know there's nothing after this life? Like, why would I believe that? Biologically, our bodies, the molecules, maybe take it up into the soil. That's fine. But what's true biologically then doesn't rule out or preclude what is also true theologically or spiritually. Does that make sense? It's called reductionism. It's an argument when you say, okay, if we understand something biologically, then that answers all of our questions, or that summarizes everything that's to be known about humanity. Well, that's not true at all. That's a way oversimplification. You actually have to deal with, well, how do you know there's nothing after death? That's still an important question. Even if you can talk about death biologically, what's happening to our physical molecules, that doesn't answer the question of what happens after we die. It just doesn't go that far, and to think that way would be reductionistic. It would be an oversimplification of reality. So the question still stands, what if there is actually a life after this life? It's not a comfort just to say death is natural, we become fertilizer. Even if it's true biologically. Because what if God made us for a life after this life? Just consider this maybe for a moment too. Most people I know, including my secular friends, we hope for a world where justice and evil have been removed, where the poor are no longer oppressed, where children have the opportunity to learn and grow and receive education, where there's justice is done for all, where kids would drink fresh drinking water. Do you want that? I want that. That's the world I long for. I want a world where the Earth's ecology functions as it's supposed to without all the pollution and garbage that we're putting into it. Why do we hope for a world like that? Could it be that we were made for a world like that? In fact, it's exactly the world God promises that will come in the life after this life. I probably won't get to this point, but on your sheet, on your handout, you've got notes on one side, small groups on the other. I've got a big block quote from Tim Keller from his book, Making Sense of God. And he includes a great section. You can just read it on your own at some point. Don't want to distract you now, but you'll find it there. And I think he makes a really good point about what the hope of life to come looks like, as much as we can know. So why do we want that hope? I think because God has made us for that kind of world. Now, I know that all I've said for this moment is, I've raised the question, because something's biologically true, that doesn't preclude the theological realities, the spiritual realities. That doesn't prove anything. I totally agree with that. But I just want to raise that question for us. But the other thing I think we need to notice is that Paul actually launches into a positive argument. Like, why believe in life after this life, that we'll be raised to the dead? Why would I believe that? He tells us next. Listen to what Paul writes. He stated that Jesus has died, that Jesus was buried, and that he was raised again on the third day. And then he says this, and he, Jesus, appeared to Cephas. That's the name for Peter. And then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. Most of them who are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And that's a euphemism for have died. Then he appeared to James, and then to the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me as one abnormally born. What's Paul doing here? Jesus died. That's easy to believe. We all do. He was buried. Fair enough. That's what you do with dead bodies. But then raised back to life. Like, why believe that? And here's his answer. Because Jesus appeared to many, many people, over 500, on multiple occasions. And just follow this out for a second here, too. Jesus was crucified, raised again, as I believe, on almost certainly 33 AD, or Common Era. Paul writes this letter in 52 or 53. So what's the time span that we're talking about here? 19, 20 years tops. All these people had seen Jesus raised in a body, and then he says, some have fallen asleep, but most of them are still alive, implying, you want to know about this? You can go ask them yourself. The witnesses to Jesus' resurrection are still alive when he writes this letter. I think that's important. I think that's really strong evidence that, at least within the text, that Paul is saying, you guys can trust this story. But there's more, for sure. Jesus' resurrection was completely unexpected. And here's a historical question that historians have to wrestle with. How did early Christianity start and take traction in the ancient world? So there's two major problems. The first is this. The Jewish people, Jesus, Paul, the Jewish, their belief system, they believed in resurrection. Most of them did, except the Sadducees. That's why they're sad, you see. They believed in resurrection, but the resurrection they believed in was only at the end of history. They had no category for a resurrection in the middle of history, you might say. And now I recognize, so I'm going to follow through that in a moment, but I have to hit pause, because I know that what I just said there, some of you are going to scratch your head. Because the young adults did this Monday, that's how I know that. So Dave, you're saying that Jesus' resurrection in the middle of history, that was like the only resurrection? What about Lazarus? He was raised from the dead. What about Jairus' daughter, the synagogue leader? She was raised from the dead. What about them? Wasn't that resurrection? Brace yourself, it's not. None of those are resurrection. And here's how you know. Did Lazarus die again? Yes. Did Jairus' daughter die again? Did Jesus die again? That's the difference. Jesus was raised in an imperishable body. Glorious, powerful, different sort even than Lazarus experienced in his being raised. That miracle is a different thing. There has only and ever been one resurrection from the dead, ever. And it's Jesus of Nazareth. Paul will go on later to say in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, that Christ was raised the first fruits. Meaning, he's the first to ever be raised from the dead. He went first through the grave and into that kind of body. Now, was his body just sort of spiritual, like a ghost, like a spiritual resurrection? There's some Christian groups that actually would say, well, we can't really say that Jesus was actually miraculously raised. And they'll argue that. And then, Paul will go on to say, then you're still in your sins. If you keep reading this chunk and you have no hope for the future, you should just give it up now. No. Listen to what Jesus himself says in Luke 24, 38 to 39. He says to his disciples, he's just walked into the room, which was locked, and they're scratching their heads already. And they think he's a ghost, because people don't walk into rooms that are locked. They think he's a ghost. Here's what he says. Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have what? Flesh and bones, as you see I have. Jesus' resurrection was not a spiritual resurrection. It was a flesh and bone, real body. And that's the hope of the Christian faith. That the kind of body Jesus received at the resurrection is the kind of body we will live in for all of eternity as well when we experience resurrection at the end of history if we've trusted Jesus as our Savior. Does that make any sense? Okay. Now actually back to the main point. That was my aside. Boom. Resurrection, only one. Only one's ever happened. Jesus of Nazareth. No one else has ever been resurrected. And the Jews had no category for that. For a resurrection in the middle of history. So it was theologically untenable, their worldview, there's no space for that. How could they believe that? Second point, and I've said this already, but Paul's actually addressing a major problem in the church, and here's the problem. He says in verse 12, but if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, which is what he's preached, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? You see, at least some in the community had resorted back to the Greco-Roman view that resurrection is gross. It's like a zombie apocalypse. You wouldn't want to believe that, because they believed that the spiritual was good, but the material was gross, bad. It was dirty. They didn't want to believe it. So for Greco-Roman people to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus was something that they wouldn't want to have anything to do with. Then you've got to come back to this historical question. How could Christianity take root in that world? Jews don't have a category for it. Greco-Romans don't even want that. Here's what historian and New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, he's not in the backwoods of academia, by the way. This is his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. Really good, really hard reading. But 737 pages dealing with this historical problem. He's taught at Oxford, he's taught at Cambridge, he now teaches at St. Andrews. And here's how he concludes. The actual bodily resurrection of Jesus Not a mere resuscitation, but a transforming revivification clearly provides a necessary condition for these things. That is, the empty tomb and the spread of Christianity in the ancient world. In other words, that no other explanation could or would do. All the efforts to find alternative explanations fail, and they were bound to do so. Why? Whoa, that's a strong statement, NT, right? You're kind of saying there is no other plausible explanation for the beginning of historic Christianity except that Jesus of Nazareth showed up in a body after he had been dead. And he appeared to Peter, the 12, more than 500 at one time, and you can go ask them. That's how Christianity starts, is that Jesus was raised from the dead. Actually. That's the only thing that could change the worldview of Jews and Gentiles overnight. See, the Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus is not blind faith. It's not, well, that's kind of wishful thinking. No, it's well-reasoned faith. And when we reason it well, we can say this is a story I can trust. If we don't rule out, kind of off the top that miracles are impossible, many people, historians will approach this question and say, well, it can't be resurrection because miracles don't happen. So what are the options? And they've come up with none that are plausible. If you haven't ruled out the possibility of miracles, and this is actually an important thing to know too. A, we can't disprove the possibility of God. You can make arguments against God for sure, but you can't rule that out philosophically to say there is no God. No, so if there's possibility that there is a God, then I have to at least be open to the possibility that there are miracles too. And so if I hold open the possibility of miracles and look at this historical question and say, boy, that one fits the bill better than any other explanation. So it's a well-reasoned faith, but not only that, this is the true story of Jesus' death and resurrection, but it not only is something that we can think about intellectually, it can become our story. In fact, it must become our story too. This past Sunday, I was playing at Prince Charles Park with my kids, not this Saturday, the one before, and this is like this big donut on the ground. It's about, 5 feet across. It moves, and because I'm as agile as a cat, I ran up there playing with my kids, showing them how big, how fun Daddy is, good stuff. And I jumped on this thing, and I knew it was going to move, but not being as agile as a cat, it went out from under me. And then I tried to flail and catch myself, and that just made it worse. And I came down kind of on my back / head, neck, and then hit the ground. And of course, the other parents are kind of, are you okay? And I'm like, my pride, not so much, but the rest of me, yes, I'm fine. But let me tell you, the next few days, I knew I wiped out. Tuesday, I was writing this message, and I got to this point, I'm like, oh, my back, my neck. And so I grabbed an Advil, and I didn't have any water, so I went to the kitchen to go get some water right over here. And I came back, I got going back on my work again, and like 10, 15 minutes later, I'm like, this is getting worse, not better. Like, wasn't one Advil enough? Man, I'm in pain. And I just happened to put my hand in my pocket, and I pulled out the Advil. I hadn't taken it. I totally forgot. I hadn't received it. But at the beginning of this passage, Paul says this. He says, this is the good news. And what does he say about the message? That you received. That you internalized. That you took into yourself and let it work on you. Knowing what the gospel message is one thing. Letting it go into yourself. Letting it transform you, take its effect on you. That's what Paul's talking about here. So the gospel message isn't just something to know about. It has to be internalized. We have to make this story our story. And then he talks about it being where their feet are planted. You know what? There is no neutral ground to plant your feet. Sorry to say. You can't say, well, that's just faith over there. I'm just going to be reasonable. No, we're always trusting in something or someone. The question is, where is your hope? What is your story? Is your story big enough to tell you that you have a future? That your sins are forgiven? That you have a purpose to life? Is that your story? Is your story big enough to tell you those things? The Christian story is. And it gives us a hope that even the work that we do here and now on this earth It's not all for nothing. It's not all going to burn up one day and our names be forgotten. No. We do have a future and a hope and a life that goes on. And so Paul can say this to the church. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Why is it not in vain? Because it's not the end of you. What you do now, the way you love others, the way you work towards seeing peace and renewal, justice being done, the good news of the gospel shared with your neighbors, all of that work is not in vain, because it will go on for eternity for those who put their hope in Jesus. Have you done that? Is that where your feet stand? I hope this message encourages you to put your trust where it really needs to be, on the only one who can save you, the only one who can give you new life. If you've put your faith there, stand firm, Paul says. I hope this text encourages you to do that. Your work is not in vain. I'm going to call the worship team to come forward. And as they do, let's just pray together. Father, we thank you.